In this video, I'll show you how to add texture to portraits taken against plain studio walls. Hello, I'm Gavin Hoey and you're watching Adorama TV, brought to you by Adorama, the camera store that's got everything for us photographers. And in this video, I'm going to show you how to take textured portraits in your studio when you don't have a textured wall to shoot against. Now, this is going to mean there will be some post-processing Photoshop. We'll get to that towards the end, but for now, it's all about the photography and particularly the background. Now, if you're going to do this regularly, invest in some seamless paper, preferably grey. It just makes life a little bit easier. But if you're going to do this irregularly, you can actually get away with something much more basic for the background, as long as it's fairly smooth. So, with that in mind, let's get a light set, let's get a model in, let's get shooting. So to help me out today, I've got the amazing Beth. Beth's going to be the model for this, but before we take any pictures, let's talk about the background. Now remember, I'm going to replace this background with something with a bit more texture. But to begin with, I've got this fairly plain background. Now, in this case, this is actually a painter's dust sheet. And yes, I know it's not completely smooth, it's full of creases, and it's not really texture-free. But that's not going to matter too much, partly because I'm going to blur this out with a shallower depth of field, but mostly because we're going to put some texture on top of that anyway. Now what you will notice is the colour. Now I've chosen that background because the new background I want to add is actually fairly close in tone. So that kind of makes sense to choose something that's about right to begin with. Right, let's take our first picture. Now, where you put the light's entirely up to you, depending on the look you want to achieve. I've gone with a fairly straightforward position with a little bit of shadow falling on Beth. I'm just going to check my exposure though, because although we're going to do some Photoshop work, one of the things I don't want to do is fix the exposure, especially when I can get it right in camera. So I'm going to shoot wide open for my lens, f2.8. So I get my flash to match my camera, and let's take a test shot like this. Okay, Beth, here we go. And when I do that, that works just fine. I've got a nice exposure on Beth, but that background looks nothing like you saw in the video. So for the background, I'm actually going to add in a second light. In fact, the way I'm going to light this whole scene is exactly the same as if this background really was a textured background. Don't treat your shot any differently to a normal shoot, even though you're going to do some post-processing later. So a second light, I'm going to pop this in right behind Beth. I'm going to turn on the modeling light so I can see where the light falls and point it straight back. Something like that. Let's take a test picture, see how this looks. That's great, that puts a little bit of light on that background. I'm happy with that. So that's my basic setup done. So now all we need to do is add some props for Beth to interact with and do a shoot. So Beth, are you ready? Okay, let's find you something to work with. Guess I'm going to go with a bowl of fruit first. Let's try that. Okay, so let's start with, can I hold it in two hands down there? Other plant back across. That's it. Yeah. Go turn towards that light. That's the way. So that's the photography done, and now I get to move into the post-processing, something I always knew was going to happen. Now to make this easier for me to get my head round, I've broken it down into three parts. There is any processing of the portrait, adding the texture, and then fine-tuning to blend everything together. So let's have a look at one of the pictures. And by the way, yes, I do have a bit of a cold, but I'm fine.
So here's one of the images I want to add in the texture. In the processing through Camera Raw, I reduced the vibrancy to give it this sort of washed out look, and I think that suits Beth's look really well. So, what about the texture? Well, there's loads of textures online. You can buy them, you can find a few for free. This is a free one from my website at gavtrain.com. All I'm going to do with this texture is first select it here inside of Photoshop. I go to Select and All, then go to Edit and Copy, back to my main portrait, back to Edit and Paste. Now that will paste the texture on top of the portrait, and because Photoshop works in this way, when you paste, you cover up what was underneath. Now, in this case, it's covered it up and then some, because that texture is actually bigger than the portrait. So I'm going to go to Edit, Free Transform, find the missing bit, there it is, and just sort of make it all fit, something like that. Click on the tick or press Enter to commit to that change. Now, one of the advantages of using layers is that you can blend them together, and this is how you create the texture and the final image together. So I'm going to change the layer blending mode on the layers panel from normal, and I could choose, say, multiply for a darker look. I could choose screen for a brighter look, but mostly it's going to be either overlay, soft light, or in this case, hard light for a little bit more of a dramatic looking texture. It all really depends on the image underneath and the texture you're using. So that applies the texture, but it's gone absolutely everywhere, including all over Beth's face. So I need to fix that. But first, there's one more thing that may not be so obvious at first sight. Have a look. So when I was shooting these pictures, I was using a wide aperture for a shallow-ish depth of field, but now I've got an in-focus texture, so that doesn't really quite work. So I'm going to go up to Filter, I'm going to choose Blur, and I'm going to Gaussian blur this texture, maybe, I don't know, 5 pixels, looks about right, just enough to recreate the look of a depth in this picture. And it does work, because you can now see that the hairs, those fine hairs, do actually stand out where before they were lost in the texture. But the texture does go all over her skin, so we need to fix that, because that isn't healthy in any way, shape or form. And I'm going to do that by using a layer mask. So layer, let's come down to layer mask and reveal all. And then I'm just going to get a paintbrush, make sure my paintbrush is set to black, and try and get the brush opacity down to something like about 30%, 40%, just so I build the effect up with lots and lots of small clicks. I'm going to keep changing my brush size as I go. I'm using the square brackets to make my brush bigger and smaller, and this should just help to blend it in. Really, I'm just trying to remove it from the skin and leave the texture blending into the hair and the clothes. Okay, and I could stop there. I'm really happy with the texture. It looks like it was always there. But to really bring this together as a complete final photo, I'm going to add a little bit of toning. You don't have to do that, but I think it'll help in this case. So for the toning effect, I'm actually going to use the color lookup tables here inside of Photoshop. Now, I'm going to find them via the adjustments panel. You can also do it under image adjustments. It's this little grid of 9 here. Click on that, and then I'm going to choose, well, we could do all sorts of things, but it's the top one here, and I want a nice warm color tone, so I'm going to add the full colors look. That looks pretty good. That adds a lovely warmth to both the texture, to Beth, the background. It all looks really good. It's perhaps just a little bit strong, so I'm going to pull the opacity back for that layer. Let's make it around about 70-ish%. And again, you could stop here, but for one more go, let's add one more of these color lookup tables. And this time I'm going to go with tension green, which adds a very weird tone, but I only want a little bit of that. So we'll bring that down to the high teens. And that just adds just a little bit of tonality to that picture. And again, helps just to blend the whole thing together. And with a few other tweaks and a bit of contrast adjustment, there is my final image complete with its brand new background. In an ideal world, I'd probably have this texture on my studio wall so I could do everything in camera. But there's actually a big advantage to adding textures in Photoshop, and it's basically this. You're not stuck with the same textured wall in your studio forever and ever, because trust me, that can become quite grating after a while. Now, if you've enjoyed this video or you've got any questions, leave me a comment below. Click on the bell icon for regular notifications, all the brand new videos right here on Adorama TV, and of course, click on that subscribe button. I'm Gavin Hoey. Thanks for watching.